I'm just going to spend the introduction just tonight, just in these verses in Ezekiel 33. To a lot of us, they're going to be very familiar. It's those verses that talk about a watchman. And a watchman is not a job that we necessarily need in modern times. Probably we did have people in a fire watch before, people who would go up in a high tower, and they would look for forest fires or things like that at places that needed that. But in the ancient times, what we call Bible times a lot, they did have a man who was supposed to reside in a watchtower, and he was supposed to watch for invading armies. And if some dangerous group of people came around, he was to sound the alarm, and then everyone in the city would be alerted to the presence of these enemies. They could get the defenses ready, defend themselves, and all that. And so the watchman had a very important job to basically keep the city safe, to warn people of any threats or danger that could be coming. And so in Ezekiel chapter 33, starting at verse 2, this is what God said about a watchman. He said, "When I bring a sword upon the land," and by that he means when I'm letting an invading army come in, maybe to attempt to capture or attack a city. He said, "And the people of the land take a man from their territory and make him their watchman. When he sees the sword coming upon the land, if he blows the trumpet and warns the people, then whoever hears the sound of the trumpet and does not take warning, if the sword comes and takes him away, his blood shall be on his own head. He heard the sound of the trumpet, but did not take warning. His blood shall be upon himself. But he who takes warning will save his life. But if the watchman sees the sword coming and does not blow the trumpet, and the people are not warned, and the sword comes and takes any person from among them, he is taken away in his iniquity, but his blood I will require at the watchman's hand." So in other words, if the watchman sounds the alarm and you ignore him, and then you die, God's saying, well, that's your own fault because you didn't listen to the warning. Pretty basic and plain. You're supposed to listen to the warning to save your own life. But if the enemy is coming and the watchman doesn't even blow the trumpet for whatever reason, he doesn't warn the people, doesn't sound the alarm, and then the enemies come in and kill you, is that your fault then? Well, God says, no, that's not your fault. Then that's the watchman's fault. Then he holds the watchman responsible for that because he was supposed to warn the people. So, we all agree probably that the watchman has a very important job. If he doesn't do his job and warn the people and the people die, it's his fault. And then this is what God said to Ezekiel. "So you, son of man, I have made you a watchman for the house of Israel. Therefore you shall hear a word from my mouth and warn them for me. When I say to the wicked, O wicked man, you shall surely die, and you do not speak to warn the wicked from his way, that wicked man shall die in his iniquity, but his blood I will require at your hand. Nevertheless, if you warn the wicked to turn from his way, and he does not turn from his way, he shall die in his iniquity, but you have delivered your soul." So what God said to Ezekiel is, you have a job, Ezekiel. It is your job to warn people that they sin, that there's a God who judges sin, that there is a hell. And God says to us, if you are a Christian, it's also our job to warn people, our job to reach out to people, tell them about God, tell them that there's a God who judges sin, but that there is a Jesus who died for their sins. These are all things that God wants us to tell people too, that there's a God who wants to forgive them. And that's a responsibility God lays at us to say, if we don't do our job, if we don't warn the people, then their blood's on our head. Now, if we do warn them, and they don't listen, if they don't take it seriously, well, we've done our part to warn them, then their blood's on their own head. But if we don't warn them, then God says that it's our fault if they die in their sins. So this is something I'm sure you've heard before in a sermon. This is kind of familiar territory for probably all of us in here. We've heard about this before. But what I want to do tonight, and I could do a whole sermon just based on that text, just talking about the importance of sharing the gospel. But, like I was saying, we've probably heard that before. This is the Sunday night crowd. This is this is where I think we can go into a little bit more advanced stuff. Not Gospel 101. We'll go into Gospel 102 or 201 or whatever. So what my message is tonight, what I call tonight is after you share the gospel. After you share the gospel. Because a lot of times the hard part is sharing the gospel in the first place. That's for a lot of people, that's the hardest thing to do, the hardest step to make, is to share it in the first place or start to have a spiritual conversation with somebody in the first place. That can be the most stressful or nerve-wracking part. But once you get through that, they are going to have some kind of response to that. And then you're going to have some kind of response to their response, whatever their response is. It can get a little bit tricky then. So if you go ahead and turn to Acts 18 now. And what I want to do with tonight's sermon in Acts chapter 18, I want to look at some ways that people responded whenever Paul gave them the gospel, and then how Paul responded to their response. And that'll help us, I think. We'll give some principles from this that will guide you in your response to how someone responds to you whenever you share the gospel. If that all makes sense. I hope that made sense. But so what I want to do tonight is, after you share the gospel, how are people going to react, and how are we going to react to their reactions? So in Acts chapter 18, and I went through the first 4 verses this morning. Pastor John should be proud of me because last time he left me in charge of a chapter, it was Acts 14, and I did the whole chapter in one day. And then he came in the next week to do Acts 15, and he just did like one verse. So, I'm leaving most of the chapter for him tonight. I only did 4 verses this morning, but tonight we're just going to start here at verse 5. And it says, "When Silas and Timothy had come from Macedonia, Paul was compelled by the Spirit and testified to the Jews that Jesus is the Christ. But when they opposed him and blasphemed, he shook his garments and said to them, 'Your blood be upon your own heads. I am clean. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles.'" So if you give the gospel to somebody, and their response, whenever you give them the gospel, if their response is anger or blasphemy, then just stop. You don't have to go any further with them. Because if that's someone's reaction, if they're getting angry, if there's some spirit in them that rises up in that way against them, well, what Paul did then, he said, okay, I'm going to back off. We don't need to put Bible tracts in their mailbox. We don't have to bug them about it anymore. You don't have to try again next week. You have done your part. You can pray for them, but you have tried to give them the gospel, and they maybe responded with blasphemy. Has that ever happened to anyone before, where someone just blew up at you because you were talking about Jesus, and it just, the conversation went from a 2 to a 10, in about 5 seconds because they just did not want to hear it. Well, if they go that route, then trying to give them the gospel further is just going to incite them to more anger and more blasphemy. And we don't need to. Blasphemy would be saying hateful stuff against God. We don't need to incite that further if that's how they're going to respond. So if that's the response, you can just let them go whenever that happens. What Paul said, he said, your blood is going to be on your own heads. What he's thinking of is those verses that we read in Ezekiel. That's why I kind of started with those. Because Paul's saying there, okay, I have tried to be the watchman and warn you, but you didn't want to hear it. So your blood is on your own heads. And he's not going to go bugging them and all kinds of stuff because he did his part. And that was the important thing, that we do our part. As far as God's concerned with us, we just want to make sure we do our part, regardless of how someone else is going to respond. We want to do our part. So that's number 1. If that's their response, just let them go. Okay, let's go on to verse 7 here. "And he departed from there and entered the house of a certain man named Justus, one who worshipped God, whose house was next door to the synagogue. Then Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed on the Lord with all his household, and many of the Corinthians, hearing, believed and were baptized." So Crispus here, he was a synagogue leader. That means this was a Jewish man who came to believe in Jesus. Wonderful thing. Sometimes when people hear the gospel, they get saved. Some people are actually going to get saved. I think that's my second point. Yeah. That's the happy ending. That's what we want. Sometimes people will get saved, and we see that in this story right here. So I don't know if I don't have too much to say about that. I might come back to this point a little bit later. But and some people say, well, Paul just gave up on the Jews because in a few verses before, he said, "From now on, I'm going to go to the Gentiles." So some people say Paul didn't care about the Jews anymore. Well, that's not necessarily true. Here's a synagogue leader right here still getting saved. So when people, don't listen to people who say give up on the Jews. We do want to see them saved as well, even though they can be the hardest to the message of Jesus, but we don't want to just, throw in the towel on them. That's not what those verses meant 2 verses ago when Paul said, "From now on I'll go to the Gentiles," because here he is getting another Jewish man saved. And this also shows the importance right here of having good, godly men, because the family often follows the direction of what the man of the house does. If the man isn't devoted to God, setting the example, then a lot of times the rest of the family isn't going to be either. But when the man is the one, going to church, making sure his family goes to church, the rest of the family does follow that example a lot of the time. And so right here we saw that Crispus, the synagogue leader, let me look back at the verse, said he believed on the Lord with all his household. His household followed after him because he set the bar. And so that's just something there I thought about the importance of godly men. But let's go on to the next verse. Verse 9, what's people's biggest problem with sharing the gospel a lot of time? It's fear. It's like, oh, this is going to be awkward. Or what if this person doesn't like me anymore? What if I change the relationship forever? If I try this, it can be a scary thing sometimes. Or even if it's just a stranger, there's a whole other set of problems. It can be even more awkward to share the gospel with someone you don't know very well. So it takes some courage. It takes some getting out of your comfort zone. Look at verse 9 here. Now the Lord spoke to Paul in the night by a vision. Do not be afraid, but speak and do not keep silent, for I am with you. God's reminding Paul here. Even Paul got scared, I guess, because God is here having to tell him, don't be afraid, I am with you. So even Paul had to hear that sometimes. That makes me feel a little better now that I think about it. But God says, I am with you, and no one will attack you or hurt you, for I have many people in this city. You don't have to be afraid of what to say. You don't have to be afraid of how they'll react. God says, I am with you. And so my next point is just remember that God is with you. Because you don't always know how someone's going to react. You don't always know if they're going to get angry or if they're going to accept it or whatever. But God says, don't let that hold you back. Don't be afraid because I am with you. I am going to be with you. And one thing I often tell myself a lot is that I don't always feel very brave. Even being a licensed minister and all that, sharing the gospel with someone if I don't know them very well, that is something that's a little bit intimidating to me. And one thing that I have to ask myself sometimes is, can I have 10 seconds of courage? Now, I heard this somewhere one time, that I don't always have to be brave and feel like I can handle every situation life's going to throw at me, but I ask myself, can I just be brave for 10 seconds? Has anyone ever heard that before? Can you just get out there for 10 seconds and get it started and see what's going to happen next? Even if it's a phone call I don't want to make, sometimes I'm looking at my phone and I'm like, I got to call so-and-so and I don't want to talk to so-and-so. Even if it's not about something gospel related or whatever, if I just have an awkward conversation or something I don't want to do, just like, okay, can I just take 10 seconds to punch in the number and hit the green button to call? And if I can be brave for 10 seconds, we'll see what goes on from there. If you got to get a shot at the doctor, can I just be brave for 10 seconds? If you got to get up and preach twice in one Sunday, it can be a little bit intimidating. Can I just be brave for 10 seconds and see where it goes from there? A few years ago, I got this pimple on my face, and it was actually right on my nose. I don't know if anyone would remember. Something I feel like everyone remembers, but probably no one noticed. But I got this pimple on my nose that something happened with, is some kind of rare deal that it was never going to go away. Like it was, I don't remember what the doctor called it, the dermatologist here in Joplin. I don't remember what they called it, but I asked them about it, and they were like, yeah, that's never going to go away. I don't remember what they even called it. But they were like, it's just permanent. They said the only way to get it off is just to cut it off with a scalpel and, just scrape it off, which did not, kind of freaked me out. But I thought, well, I kind of put up with it for a while. I didn't want to be vain and go spend a bunch of money to fix something on my face, but it was bothering me. So I finally went, and what they had to do was put a shot in my nose. Getting a shot in your nose is like a little bit scary. And I remember going to this dermatologist, and they gave me, I thought, okay, 10 seconds of courage. Can I be brave for 10 seconds to get a shot in my nose? And so they give me the shot. I felt the needle go in, but I'm sitting there. I don't think the numbness, it was supposed to numb me before they scraped it off. I don't think the numbness was like kicking in. And I see him over here filling with the stuff. I'm like, he's going to take this scalpel to my nose, and it's going to really hurt because of the numbness. So I said to he's after a few seconds of him fidgeting around with stuff, I'm like, I don't think this is working. You gave me the shot, but I don't feel the numbness, because he told me it'd be instant. It does not feel numb to me. And he just looks at me, and he's confused. He's like, what are you talking about? And I said, well, I'm afraid when you scrape that, and I told him what I was afraid of. It's like, it's really going to hurt because I don't feel like the numbness has kicked in yet. And he's like, I scraped it off you right after I gave you the shot. I've been sitting there terrified of what's coming next, and he had just did it. I didn't even know what had been going on. So Dylan was there, I think. Weren't you in the room whenever that happened? Yeah, and that... So, sometimes if you can just be brave for 10 seconds and leave the rest in the professional's hands, he can handle the rest of what's got to happen. And God is a professional at evangelism. God can probably handle it. If you can get the conversation started, God says, I am with you. I got your back on this conversation. I can handle this talk. Whenever you get started talking, you just have to do the hard part of getting the conversation started, and then God will really take care of the rest. Then once you get the conversation started, I'd say 90% of the time, if not more, when I've had a conversation with someone about that, then I thought it was going to be awkward. Once we actually started talking, all the awkwardness dried up after that first 10 seconds. And then it was just talking. And they were a lot more open than I thought it'd be. But sometimes, God's the professional. If you can start talking, he does the hard part of melting the heart or doing whatever else needs to be done. He can handle it from there. On Wednesday night, just this past Wednesday, we took the youth to a service at Faith Assembly on the other side of town. And it was like a joint Assembly of God church service. And we had all these youth groups together. And so we all got together, and at the end of the service, they did a salvation altar call. And they had all the youth pastors go up to the front to pray with students who were wanting to get saved. And so I went up to the front, and I'm, hey, like I said, I get a little nervous about that because I don't even, some person's going to come up to me that I don't even know. and I've got to have a conversation with them, and I'm not sure what I'm supposed to say, to kind of see where they're at. So this girl comes up to me, and I was just telling myself, standing up there, I'm like, okay, when someone comes up to you, can you just be brave for 10 seconds, Luke? Can you just be brave for 10 seconds? A girl comes up, I ask her her name, and she tells me, and I said, well, what do you know about God? Because I needed to see where she was at. Like I said, this is a stranger to me. So all that I knew that she knew was what they had said in the service. And so I said, well, what do you know about God? What do you know about Jesus? I needed to see how much of the gospel she actually understood. I don't think you should ever pray with someone if you don't know that they understand the gospel. Because there's been so many people who are like, oh, I stood up in church. I prayed a prayer one time on a Sunday 20 years ago when I was 10 years old, something like that. And they prayed a prayer and they think they're going to heaven, and they have no idea what they said. They have no idea what the gospel is. And so I always want to check with people, even at something like that. I'm like, well, I got to ask a few questions, do a little probing, just to see where they're at and make sure they understand what they're about to pray. So I think that's very important. So anyway, I just said, what do you know about God? What do you know about Jesus? And we talked for a little while, and it went perfectly fine. Then I prayed a prayer with her, and I don't want to exaggerate. I think it might have been the greatest prayer of salvation in the history of evangelism on this planet. And I just say that because once I started talking, I just felt God take over my mouth. Do you ever have those experiences where you just start talking and suddenly stuff starts coming out of your mouth that you're like, where is this coming from? You don't even know what you're saying. That wasn't even in my head 5 seconds ago. But it felt like God just took over the conversation. It was amazing. And I prayed this prayer with her, and it was really awesome because I felt God take over. I felt God take over right then. And so if you can be brave for 10 seconds, a lot of times God will take care of the rest. Leave it in the professional's hands. The professional, once he takes over, Jesus said, when you get brought before men and you don't know what to say, Jesus told us the Holy Spirit would come and that the Holy Spirit would speak through us. Y'all remember whenever he said that, the Holy Spirit will meet us right then and give us the words that we need to say. I remember one time I was sitting at a Speedy Lube in Neosho, and this gentleman came in. And, if you've ever been there, you're just sitting in the little waiting room, and they're taking care of your car and doing the oil change and all that. And I'm sitting next to this guy, and we get to just having a long conversation. He's telling me about all the close encounters with death that he's had. He's like telling me about just the close calls in his life. Car accidents, all kinds of crazy things that have happened to him. And we get to talking about this. And, I'm talking to him, and I just feel God kind of telling me, well, ask him if he knows where he's going to go whenever he's going to die. And that thought just would not leave my mind. I just knew it was God. And when you just know it's God, it can, if you don't listen to God, you're going to have some regret later. So I'm like, okay, I don't want to talk to this stranger that I just don't even know his name and ask him a weird question like that. But, I went ahead and did it. Now, this guy did not get saved right there or anything like that. This did not have a happy ending. He got freaked out by me asking him about that. I could tell he was very uncomfortable with that conversation. I get to And he said some stuff, and I said some stuff back, and was kind of leading him on understanding about sin, and he's telling me why, God would never send me to hell and all this kind of stuff because of all the good things he's done. And I was kind of explaining to him why that's not correct. And, we get into it a couple minutes, and he grabs his phone. Oh, I think someone's calling me, and goes and steps outside. So we didn't have to hear any more of it. That's what's going to happen sometimes. Not everybody's going to be receptive to the message. But, as I drove away from Speedy Lube, I didn't have to have a regret that, I didn't listen to God. I didn't talk to him. And so, God will open those doors. Maybe you say, I never get an opportunity. I never get a chance to talk to someone and share with the gospel with them or something like that. And I was thinking this week, we went and got a car for Dylan this week. He's going to be 16 here in a few weeks. And we didn't get the car for him. There's actually we did go get a car, but there's a pastor down in Neosho who's very close with Dylan, and said he would gift us a car for Dylan to drive. And so he just really, really blessed Dylan. And maybe you've seen it out there parked in front of the house. So it's a very nice car, and so we're very blessed about that. It's a Mustang out there. So what do you think's been going on this week? Everywhere I'm driving, what kind of car am I noticing? Yeah, I'm seeing Mustangs everywhere because it's like, we got a Mustang now of our own. So everywhere I go right now, I see the Mustangs just left and right. Have you ever been thinking about buying a car before, like a Honda Accord or GMC Sierra or whatever? All these trucks. If you're interested in some type of vehicle and you're like, I really want to get me one of those, what do you do whenever you're driving around on the road? You're seeing that car at every stoplight, right? Because it's on your mind. It's what you're looking for. It's what's important to you. All the other cars on the road just kind of fade away because what you're thinking about is that Honda Accord. Well, if our priority is to see people saved, if that's what we really want, then we are going to find those opportunities to witness to people. If you are looking for opportunities to share the gospel, you will find opportunities to share the gospel. If you're looking for cars, you're going to find cars. If you're looking for opportunities to share the gospel, you're going to find them. Like that guy at Speedy Lube, and he's talking about all these close encounters with death that he's had. Well, that was just like an open door right there. That was a conversation starter to talking about spiritual things. If you're looking for those opportunities, you really can find them. And you don't have to be afraid because God says, I'm going to be with you through all this. When we went down to Neosho to get to this guy's house, and this was it gets so dark early on now, so it's pitch black outside, and we're driving around at these back roads around Neosho looking for the guy's house, and Emily and Dylan didn't always know right where we were at any given moment, but they didn't have to be worried or freaked out because I was the one driving. I knew where we were going. I had my hands on the steering wheel, and I knew the final destination. Well, when God takes over, we don't always know where we're going, but we know that God's got his hands on the wheel. God's guiding the conversation. God's going to make sure that it works out. So we don't always have to know what's going to happen whenever we give the gospel to someone. We don't always know how they're going to respond to that, but we can trust that we serve a God who says, I will be with you. Just like he told Paul, I will be with you. He says to us, I am going to be with you whenever you have those conversations. All right, verse 11. Let's go on to verse 11 here. And he continued there 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. This is saying Paul continued. This is in Corinth, okay? This is where the book of Corinthians is written to the church at Corinth. So 1st and 2nd Corinthians, 2 books of the Bible, or 2 letters from Paul to this church. But before he wrote those letters, he went there, evangelized the location. And that's what this chapter is about. And while he is there evangelizing, it says he tarried there 1 year and 6 months. He spent 1.5 years in Corinth. What this is telling me is that what Paul was doing there was discipleship. He did not just roll into town, give the gospel, and then roll out, like a drive-by evangelism thing, and just give it to them and go. He went there, gave them the gospel, and he hung around for 1.5 years just to make sure that they understood what they had believed, that they had a good spiritual foundation. And that's really my next, I don't know if I put this on a slide, discipleship. That's really the next really main point of whenever we give someone the gospel, if they get saved, we have got to be ready to do discipleship because that is the next step after someone gets saved. They don't get saved and then that's the end of the story and they lived happily ever after. That's not what it's supposed to be. What is the Great Commission? that Jesus said, go into all the world and make, he didn't say Christians. He didn't say go into all the world and make Christians. He said make disciples. He said make followers. And so making someone a Christian, now that's maybe the hard part, but that's just the first part. That's the most important thing, but that's not the only thing. And so once someone becomes a Christian, well, then they have to become a disciple. And that means walking out life with them. That means teaching them the Bible, teaching them what it means to live a Christian life, saying, follow Jesus as I follow Jesus, and guiding them on this spiritual journey. And it's amazing that we Christians, we've got this command of the Great Commission. We'll probably be talking about it next week with the missions convention going on. This Great Commission of going to all the world and make disciples, and yet so many Christians, if you ask them, well, what are you doing to make disciples? What's the discipleship like in your life or at your church? So many Christians would just have a deer in headlights. I don't know. We don't have anything like that. We just get them saved, and then maybe we give them a free Bible, but that's not the end of the story when they get saved. That's just the beginning of the story. And from there, they're supposed to learn all these things about discipleship. So what God said for us to do is make disciples. I was thinking this week about one of my college classes. It was English 102 that I took at Crowder College. And, I was homeschooled. So whenever I started college, that was kind of my first real school experience. And I was a whiz at English. That was my strong suit. I'm not so hot on the math stuff. That's not the half of my brain that I use. I'm more of an English and writing guy. And so English 102, I was pumped. I did great in my English 101 class. I was ready for English 102. And the very first assignment they gave us in English 102, we had to write a paper, an essay, where the teacher assigned us to go to this New York Times website. And at the New York Times website, they had an archive of all of the New York Times that had ever been printed. And they wanted us to look up what the New York Times was talking about on the day that we were born. And they said the assignment was, write about what was going on in the world on the day that you were born. And so I was born in 1990, and I went there to the New York Times website. I went to my birthday, and I was looking on this archive website. I found the newspaper that came out. The New York Times is a huge paper. I don't know if you ever looked at one. It's like 100 pages long. And so I went to their archive, and we had to write an essay that was, like I said, it's about what's going on in the world on the day that we were born. And so I looked all through there. I had to find some kind of theme, something to tie it all together. And so I went and did that. What I found out is that there were a lot of things on the day of my birth going on in Lithuania. I couldn't even tell you where Lithuania is on a map, to this day. But I just found article after article about Lithuania. And so there was a lot of civil unrest going on. There was about to be a civil war break out in the country. And I'm just this is gold. There's so much stuff here I could write about. So I ended up writing this paper all about what was going on in Lithuania on the day of my birth. And I turned in this paper. And I was excited because I felt like I had written just one of the greatest papers. I'll tell you, this teacher told us, she was a tough grader, and she said, in all my years of teaching, she said, I've never given out a perfect 100 on an essay. Or maybe she said I'd only given out one before. But, I'm thinking okay, well, I'm going to get that next 100. I'm going to be that kid. I'm going to turn it in. And I had this paper on Lithuania, and I'm like, this is gold right here. I'm going to get that next 100. And I turned it into her. And then the next class period, she gives the papers back. Only she doesn't give my paper back. And so I'm like, okay, well, this teacher is probably so impressed with my paper. When I get out of class today, she wants to give me my A personally. And I'm sitting there thinking, is she holding back my paper because she's got a perfect, maybe she wants to introduce it in front of the whole class or something, and be like, well, Luke Taylor, he got my very first 100 that I've ever handed out. I'm just waiting for this moment because I felt like I had just turned in, I don't want to exaggerate, but what is probably the greatest paper on Lithuania in 1990 that's ever been written. So here I am just waiting, and after class, she comes up to talk to me, and she gives me my paper in person, and she says, Luke, you wrote a wonderful paper about Lithuania, but that wasn't the assignment. She said, I told you I wanted you to write about what was going on in the world on your birthday. And you've given me a paper that's all about Lithuania. And she said, I'm going to let you do it over. So I had to go do that paper over because I did not follow what the assignment was all about. Someday we're going to get to heaven, and I don't want God to tell us, you did a wonderful job of making Christians, but that wasn't the assignment. God says the assignment for us is that we need to be making disciples. So that's my main point for tonight. If you take one thing away tonight, is not that we get people saved and make them Christians. We want to make people disciples. We want to walk with them on this journey of what it means to be a Christian. We want to walk people through all these things. Teach them what it means to read the Bible. Teach them why it's important. That's what we do with our kids. Our kids are kind of our disciples. We are teaching them what it means to be a godly man or a godly woman. That's what we're here to do. That's our assignment. So don't forget that. Don't forget, if there's one thing you take away tonight, it's when we get people saved, when we give them the gospel, that's not the end of the story. That's just the beginning. There's so much more after that. Let's go on to these last verses. I'm going to wrap it up here real soon. When Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, I'm at verse 12, the Jews with one accord rose up against Paul and brought him to the judgment seat, saying, this fellow persuades men to worship God contrary to the law. And when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, if it were a matter of wrongdoing or wicked crimes, O Jews, there would be reason why I should bear with you. But if it is a question of words and names in your own law, look to yourselves, for I do not want to be a judge of such matters. And he drove them from the judgment seat. So they brought Paul before him, and they said, well, you're a Roman leader, you're one of the guys in charge, and we don't like Paul very much, we want you to punish him. Could you put him to death for us? They just wanted Paul off their backs. And he says, whoa. What you guys, your spat with Paul, it's a local thing for you guys. It's a religious Jewish thing for you guys. And we're not going to get in, we Romans are not going to get in the middle of it. We're not going to order his death or kick him out or whatever. So he says, you're not going to get what you want, But what I wanted to bring up from this is that sometimes people will make up false accusations against you and even persecute you because they don't like what you had to say. You were trying to do the right thing, give them the gospel, and you maybe upset them in such a way that they want to ruin your life about it. They get so offended. Sometimes maybe you haven't even done anything like that, but you're just a good Christian and they don't like good Christians. And they have some kind of grudge against Christians. And so, again, they want to ruin your life over that. They will even make things up about you, and they will persecute you because they don't like what you have to say. And that's basically what happened to Paul then. And that's basically supposed to be the Christian experience. It's a little bit of a downer right there, but Jesus said, the world hated me, and they are going to hate you too. If you're doing the right thing, they are probably going to have some problems with that. Every Christian, every pastor that we talk about in the New Testament, he had people make up stories about him, had people try to run him down or harass him because they didn't like him, even if he was doing the right thing. It's just part of the job description of even being a pastor. It happened to Paul. People made up stuff about Paul. People mocked Paul, persecuted Paul, said things about him that weren't true. That's how you knew Paul was a good pastor, because he was getting under some people's skin. I think that's part of probably the job description of a good pastor is some people are not going to like him. Some people are not going to like everything he has to say. If you want to please everyone, open a taco stand. But if you want to spread the gospel, you're going to catch some heat. Some people are not going to want to hear it. Some people are not going to like it. You might make some enemies. So in anger, this is the last verse we'll read tonight. In anger, this is how the crowd reacts. In Acts 18:17, then all the Greeks took Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him before the judgment seat. But Gallio took no notice of these things. So they took this guy Sosthenes and they beat him. This was one of their Jewish friends. They're so mad that they couldn't get Paul killed with this Roman guy. They got so mad, they grabbed their leader there at the synagogue and just started beating him. Isn't that crazy? That's how they just erupted in anger. They were just so upset about all this. So this morning we talked about jobs, and today we're going to talk about mobs. But it's kind of weird because they just get in this fit of rage. They just lose control. That's kind of the thing about a mob. You cannot control a mob. the mob's going to do what the mob's going to do. And so Sosthenes, he was against Paul. He's not like trying to be the good guy in this story. But since their plan to get Paul killed fails, or get Paul kicked out fails, they turn on their leader Sosthenes and just beat him up. They turn on him. And so when I read this story, his name really stuck out to me because of something that happened back when I was first married and we were living at the apartment. So we were living on the other side of town, but I remember this happened at the apartment. And I was reading about Sosthenes in the Bible. But I'm like, how do you even say this guy's name? This is weird. Sosthenes? I couldn't figure it out. So I typed it into Google, and I'm just like, how do you pronounce this word? And Google popped up, and it said, Sosthenes. My computer talked to me, and it said it for me. And I remember my wife was in the room, and she just hears the computer says Sosthenes, and she's like, that's Paul's friend. And I'm like, whoa. That's how I knew I married a Bible nerd, because this random name, and she knew about it. But, actually, Sosthenes is only mentioned in 2 places in the Bible. So one of them is right here in Acts 18:17. He's mentioned right here. But he's also mentioned in one other place, and that is 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 1. When you open up to and who here has read 1 Corinthians? Who here really likes the book of 1 Corinthians? We probably all read it. Who here really likes that book? That's an awesome book. Okay? Here's what it says in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 1. Paul, called to be an apostle of Jesus Christ through the will of God, and Sosthenes, our brother. So this is later on after what's just happened here in Acts. And it mentions Sosthenes again in the first verse of the first chapter of 1 Corinthians. So if you like the book of 1 Corinthians, someday when you get to heaven, you want to thank Sosthenes because it was written to him. And we don't know Sosthenes' whole story. So in the first part here in Acts, he's a guy who had been with these people trying to bring a charge against Paul, and it didn't work out for him the way they wanted. So they grabbed Sosthenes and started beating him. Next time we hear about Sosthenes in 1 Corinthians later, this is a brother that Paul is writing the letter directed toward. So at some point, Sosthenes got saved. Now, why did Sosthenes get saved? We're never going to know the whole story unless we meet him in heaven. We don't know the whole story of how he became a brother, how he became a Christian. But here's kind of what we could probably piece together a little bit. He got beat up by his Jewish friends. They got mad, and just in a fit of rage, they just started beating him. So what maybe we could kind of piece together a little bit, he's probably thinking, okay, Paul over here, he's trying to save me, and then my friends over here, they beat me up. So probably that something clicked inside his head, and he said, whoa, maybe I want to hang out more with Paul. Maybe Paul has a little bit more of my best interest in mind than some of these other people. And Sosthenes got saved. Sosthenes eventually became a believer. And so what I'd say for my final point tonight, no matter how someone responds whenever you give them the gospel, because there could be all kinds of responses we talked about tonight, but no matter how they respond, treat them with kindness. Because people can reject your words, they can reject your information and your facts, and they can reject your God, but don't give them a reason to reject your attitude. Give them your very best as far as your attitude, because that's something that they'll remember. That's whenever they'll know that you care. Maybe you've heard it said before, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And if we show people that we care about them, a lot of times they might not get saved that first conversation, but they'll remember that. They'll remember your attitude, your heart towards them. And down the road, they might get saved because they remember that. And I think that's probably what happened with Sosthenes. He's like, well, these people beat me up. And so he went back to Paul. And what do you know? However long later, Paul's writing a letter to the Corinthian church, and he addresses it to Sosthenes there in Corinth and says, well, he's our brother now. He got saved. And so that's really awesome. Sometimes people respond with persecution, lies, all that stuff. They don't like you. But if we just give them kindness in return, that's a testimony right there. They will remember how you treated them. Okay, as we close tonight, I've got one more story. And I know that I'm breaking all the rules here of, know your audience and all that kind of stuff. But you got to remember, I'm a youth pastor. Okay, so bear with me for this one last story. Terrible movie that came out last year in November called Justice League. Superhero movie. I know you guys don't care. But and this is not even a good movie, but I did go to see this with someone from the youth and who's here with us tonight. We went to watch this movie, and there is this one scene that really stuck out to me. This is just, when I saw this scene, even though I hated the movie, I hated the movie, but there's this one scene that I'll probably never forget. And you've got Batman and the Flash, and they're teaming up, in this movie. And there's this room full of hostages, this room full of people, and the bad guys have guns and all that stuff, and they got to save this hostage, or these hostages. And the Flash character, he's got the super speed power, and he's like, I'm afraid to go in there. I'm afraid what's going to happen to me. If I go in there, I'm afraid I'll get shot. I mean, he's about to throw up outside of the room. He's like, he tells Batman, I can't do it. I can't go in there and save anybody. You're going to have to do it alone. And Batman turns to him, and Batman says, just save one. And the Flash is like, really? You just want me to go in there and save one person? And Batman says, yeah, save one. And so the Flash is like, okay, I'm just going to go in there and save one. And he's got the super speed thing. He goes in and saves one person. And he comes out of that room saving that one person, and he's like, okay. And he knew how good it felt to get one person saved. Well, he didn't stop there, of course. He's like, okay, well, it feels this good just to save one. I can go in there and save one more. And he goes in and gets another person out. And he goes in and he gets another person out. And he keeps just doing it until everyone's safe because he saved one. And once he felt what that felt like to save somebody, he was able to get the whole room saved. And that's really what I thought that scene, I'm like, man, some Christians have never even got one person saved before. And what I'd say to them is just the same thing. Save one. If you can get one person saved and you see what that feels like, you want to do it again. You want to see even more. So that's my challenge to you all. If you haven't saved someone, save one. Maybe you think, well, man, if I share the gospel with somebody and they don't listen, there's like a 10% chance they'd even get saved. It's just not worth the risk. Okay, give the gospel to 10 people and save one to see if one person will listen. You'd be surprised what's going to happen whenever you share the gospel. All right, I'm going to pray and let it go tonight. Jesus, we just thank you for making us all ministers of the gospel. Lord, giving us all this great commission to go out in all the world to make disciples. So Lord, I pray that for each one of us that we would save one, but that we wouldn't stop there, that we would make them disciples. We'd teach them how to follow you and walk this spiritual life. And then they can go out and they can save one, and that we can see this world turned upside down to the right way up for you, Jesus, for your kingdom. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.